Hi there, team, and welcome to our second module on creating a culture of assessment at Middleton. This is going beyond the characteristics and the basic understanding of our assessment that we looked at in our previous workshop and looking specifically at the importance of assessment for, of, and as learning. So our statement today and our intention is to get a good understanding of assessment for, of, and as learning, and then take it a little bit further in terms of application and think, how do we embed this into our learning context? So there are three key types of assessment that we're talking about today. And it's important to note that each one of them is important on its own, but they're most impactful when they blend together and form part of your assessment toolkit. So what do our students really need when it comes to assessment? They need a bit of everything. It needs to be a balanced approach. It's not okay to just have summative assessments, but at the same time, we can't just be doing pre-assessment and then not checking in and making sure that students are developing their skills and understandings along the way. And of course, everything that we're talking about today is heavily researched, and two of the most well-renowned researchers in this area are Black and William. So to kick things off, we're going to take a parable approach and share a story with you from my holiday to just illustrate the importance and the simplicity of assessment for, of, and as learning. So recently we were able to go back to Australia, and we were fortunate enough to be camping on the beach in a little town called Walkerville. And in the morning, while having our coffee, I managed to just watch our three kids on the foreshore there playing in the sand and looking at the water. And as three curious kids do, inevitably they started picking up rocks and hurling them into the ocean. After a while, they sort of played off each other, got some feedback, and realized that they were trying to skip stones effectively. And each of them had a different technique. Our eldest was more aggressive and went for brute force. Our middle child was more creative and was looking at style and technique and how the stone moved across the water. And our youngest was far more interested in the aesthetics of the stone. What was the right shape that was going to enable it to skim across the water and counteract those waves there? So being an educator and a teacher always, I couldn't help but think this is a great example of assessment for learning. It was prior knowledge, and it was also giving me an opportunity to witness their skills in action in a really active capacity. So assessment for learning essentially is about informing future teaching and learning. It's giving us a baseline of their skills and understanding as they are now, with the intention of informing future practice. It's conducted throughout the learning process, so it's not just once, and it's iterative and it's interactive. So for the stones example, the kids were engaged, they were participating, and you could see them tweaking and adjusting their styles as they went along. From a more academic perspective, what are the key elements that we're looking for when we're talking about assessment for learning? One, we're looking at student involvement. Two, we're looking at a blend of not only quantitative data, but qualitative data. It can be observations and feedback, questionnaires, dialogues between yourself and the student, learning journeys, and it's context-based. It's got to be relevant. In this context, it was completely inappropriate to pull out a clipboard and document it down. It was much more appropriate to have a relational conversation and look at the next steps. So assessment for learning ultimately is learner-centered. It's forward-thinking and involves the entire learning community. It's a collaborative effort that starts with assessment of prior knowledge to determine what students know and what they're able to do with further guidance. And that is a crucial part of any topic or unit of inquiry or strand of mathematics, or it doesn't matter what it is you're trying to teach them. Assessment for learning comes at the beginning, and it is an integral part of the assessment practice. And we have to value the child and know what they already know in order to take them further on their journey. So after conducting a bit of formative assessment and understanding assessment for learning, I went down and gave the kids some feedback and suggested a few new techniques about considering where the smoothest ocean was, and that the technique probably needed to shift from just hurling it to turning to the side and tweaking it. And so with a bit more practice, I left and they continued there to practice their stone skipping. Assessment as learning was happening during the process. It's similar in a way because it's still part of the formative process. Its goal is to support students in learning how to become self-regulated lifelong learner. So this happened in the context of the stones, as after one of them threw a bad stone, they automatically got a little bit frustrated and corrected their technique. After multiple attempts of different rock sizes, again, they shifted, took on feedback, and changed it. So assessment as learning is happening all the time in our classroom. And it's an important element that we need to give space for, that we allow kids to course correct, take feedback from their learning, give them feedback, and continue to develop their understandings as part of the process. So what does that look like? It talks about monitoring and setting goals. So the first goal might have been to skip two bounces in a row. The next goal is to skip 3 and 4 and so on. It's about pivoting and adjusting learning and being comfortable with that in the classroom, that is exactly what we want our students to be doing. And there's that agentic aspect that students are driving their own learning. They should know where they're going, but this is about them. So there's an element of them being active, but also metacognition and reflecting on their thinking and how they're going along the way. So assessment as learning promotes learning by helping students to take responsibility while developing their enthusiasm for their learning. The more we encourage students to actively design, manage, and measure their own learning, they develop the skills to use self-assessments and to reflect, which is a really powerful tool. And if you have a look at Hattie's work, the power of reflection and peer feedback is a really important tool, but it has to be developed with a teacher side by side, giving them the language and the structures around assessment as learning. So these are two key parts that we often have at the beginning of a unit of inquiry or at the beginning of a course of study. For one, by valuing assessment for and as learning, we are tuning into the student's prior understanding, which is a great inquiry concept from Kath Murdoch there. It's not about tuning in the sense of it's a wow, it's a provocation. It's tuning into their prior understanding or misconceptions. But it also brings to mind and highlights to you, your attention, what they already know and what they don't know. And that if we're going to teach them something valuable from a neuroscience perspective, we need to really hone in on what their current level of understanding is before we can take them to the next deeper level. So being the educator that I am, I thought, you know what? We've seen examples of assessment for, and we've seen examples of assessment as learning. I decided to set up the Olympics of stone skipping a couple of days later when we were a little bit further around the coast and we found a beautiful, beautiful bit of beach here. And we did the official assessment of learning practices, which was the stone skipping Olympics. And we marked out 2 lines in the sand and figured out that was about 20 meters and decided to stand in the water and see how many stones you could skip within that duration of stretch of beach. And we were aiming for basically an A star of 5 skips, and then we went down to a credit and a pass. That is a really simple example of assessment of learning. It's performance-based. It gives you a one shot to be the champion or not. And obviously I didn't do that with the kids. It was stone skipping on the holidays. But assessment of learning does take place in schools and in life, and it is an important element, but it's not the only element in the assessment toolkit. So assessment of learning, we commonly refer to this as summative assessment. Its goal is to certify and report on the learning progress. It's typically conducted at the end of a developmental stage or program. So it doesn't have to be after 6 weeks. It can be when the student is developmentally ready, and then you move on to new learning. So it can close the loop and bring yourself back to assessment for learning. And there is an important place of assessment of learning. But again, I want to reiterate that this is not why we're in the whole thing. Because the downside is that it has limited student involvement. It tends to be structured by the teacher and set in place. However, it can be fantastic at producing quantitative data, whether it's tests and exams, because it gives us an element of standardization that we can measure growth and progress against. It's often criteria or norm referenced. So it's important that before students sit any sort of summative assessment, they're well aware of the criteria and the norms before they head into that. And so to wrap up with our assessment of learning, it's an integral part of the learning. At appropriate points in the learning journey, it provides learners with an opportunity to gauge their acquisition of knowledge, development, and conceptual skills and understanding. So hopefully that's given you an idea of, in a very simplistic manner, the 3 different types of assessment practices that we're hoping to see in Middleton classrooms. If I had to weight them, and using a traffic kind of light system here, the big chunk that we should see in our planning documentation, in our units of inquiry, and in the language that we're using with our kids is assessment for learning. Second, it's assessment as learning, slightly smaller, but still playing a big, big role. And last, we've got assessment of learning. still playing a role in our classrooms, but not in comparison to assessment for learning. And this is really important to understand as we move forward. So to sum it up, from Clark and from Earl, assessment produces evidence of student learning, continuously monitoring, documenting and measuring learning, and then analysing assessment data provides insights into students' understanding, knowledge, and dispositions. And that's what we're after. So hopefully that's given you a brief recap of our workshop on different types of assessment and the whole notion of developing a really positive and evidence-based culture of assessment at Middleton. Thanks.